Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 49, Official Ultimatums. You know, I feel like I should have seen this coming, Toby mused idly, taking a step forward. As he did so, the blade slid cleanly out of his chest, revealing it hadn't so much as nicked his robes. Of course, the betrayal I saw a mile away, it was simply a matter of when. I had thought it would be when you were more desperate. In fact, I was planning a whole situation with your brother to force your hand. Guess I don't need to now. Maybe just for fun. I will never forgive you for what you did to the Uchiha, or my village, Itachi responded coolly. Toby clapped loudly, says the man who murdered them everybody. The Uchiha prodigy's eyes narrowed. I stopped a rebellion that would have torn my village apart. You murdered women and children, innocents. The masked man gave a dramatic sigh. Well, I just hate to see a job half finished. He straightened up, sending a sideways glance towards Naruto. I note our resident Hokage seems less than confused about this plot-thickening turn of affairs. Sometimes, people do trust me to actually think situations out and not just react on emotion. Naruto shifted his shoulders and sent an apologetic look at his old teammate. Some things, the Hokage needs to know. Here is an informed you of my request then. Itachi asked, eyes softening at the lack of hostility from his oldest friend. And I'll honor it, you can be sure of that. Ugh, Toby cut in, somebody save me from the diabetes already. Could we, maybe, get back to the coolie stabby stuff? If you insist, Itachi said, sheathing his tanto in a smooth motion and looking across at Naruto. I assume you have been developing a plan to deal with this one. The redhead mimed, weighing something in his hand. Gears are turning. Then you won't mind if I go first? Oh, by all means. Sounds like you've wanted to kill this guy a lot longer than I have. Itachi simply turned to stare murderously at that taunting orange mask. You have no idea. The tension of the standoff seemed to lock everybody's feet in place. It shattered when both the Azura Path and Animal Path bolted in opposite directions. Kakashi immediately tried to head off the Azura Path, knowing that, with his explosives, he could cause some serious damage to the village. He didn't know what the other one could do, or if it was worse, but he would always take the known variable. Thankfully, Guy seemed inclined to think the opposite and made off after the Animal Path. The other two paths didn't seem too enamored with this idea, and Kakashi was forced to backpedal away from the Prita path. He didn't know if the man could absorb chakra from people as well as techniques and didn't want to find out. He wasn't much of an endurance fighter as it was, and the Sharingan was already eating into his reserves. Likewise, Guy suddenly found himself engrossed in a fight with the Naraka path, the pierced man using his improbable strength to power through the green beast's skill. They were fast. Kakashi's Sharingan spun wildly as it tried to track the beefy man's movements. In taijutsu alone they seemed evenly matched. Of course, if Kakashi's bag of tricks was as shallow as hand-to-hand, he would have died years ago. He diverted a punch to the side and, using the same hand, suddenly speared his arm forward. It took a lot out of him to get his rakery going that fast, and it showed. He was too slow. The orange-haired man leaned back, letting the deadly technique slice through his robes. He retaliated by reaching out to grab Kakashi's outstretched hand. Thankfully he was fast enough to dodge that, skipping back a few steps to take stock again. This was going nowhere. Kakashi was all about his jutsu, using them to change the environment and force his opponent into a disadvantageous position to be finished off. This guy's ability to absorb chakra was throwing a wrench into his normal style. So, time to do something he'd normally never do. Guy, a little help. The reaction was instantaneous. The air was filled with the roar of unrestrained energy as Guy suddenly cranked it up to 11, unlocking the next 3 gates in less time than it took most shinobi to go through a string of hand seals. Yosh! Come in, Kai. Now wreathed in an intense blue aura that caused dust to swirl around him chaotically, Guy leapt backwards into the air. His fists became blurs as he pounded the air over and over again. Morning Peacock. For a moment, it looked like the entire Uchiha clan had returned to rain fire from the sky as an uncountable number of fireballs ripped through the air at the Preta path. Kakashi smiled grimly as the man fell for the trap, immediately stepping forward to absorb the technique. His rippled eyes widened in shock as the fireballs, the result of pure friction as opposed to any jutsu, tore right through whatever bubble was absorbing the chakra and slammed him into the ground. Guy just kept at it, the momentum of his punches actually keeping him in the air as he rained fiery doom down on the stocky man. Also, as Kakashi predicted, the Naruto path attempted to use the taijutsu master's moment of distraction to attack. A black rod slid from his sleeve, but just as he was about to hurl it at Guy, it warped and twisted. The distortion in the air spread to the rest of the man's arm, and before he knew it, it vanished with a sick ripping noise. Kamui, Kakashi muttered, voice wavering slightly as he felt his body begin to give out. He'd used too much chakra and the Mangekyo Sharingan had pushed him over the edge. Luckily, Guy had finished up. Nothing was left of the Preta path but a few smoking strands of fabric. He didn't even have to touch the ground to target the Naruto path, kicking off the air with a small sonic boom and slamming right into the remaining path with the force of a wrecking ball. Leaf-cutting square. Kakashi tracked his flight through a few buildings before losing sight of him. His eyes went blurry and he could already feel his consciousness slipping. He didn't hit the ground though. Instead, he found Guy, looking just as harried as him from using 6 of the gates, lowering him gently to the street. A most youthful fight, my friend. Teamwork won us the day and now we must trust our comrades to finish the rest of them. Kakashi found just enough energy to lower his headband back down over his eye. Sorry Guy, did you say something? Pain frowned when his connection with the Naruto path cut out abruptly. He no longer had the ability to revive his bodies, and the Preta path was gone too. He couldn't afford to let this drag on for too much longer, his bodies were weaker alone than as a unit. Refocusing on the current situation, he sent a mental command to the Azura path and began walking back through the buildings he had crashed through a moment ago. Tsunade of the Sunin, I had not expected you to interfere. No matter, you will die just as easily as your teammate. The blonde sneered at him, hefting the enormous sword on her shoulder with absurd ease. I never thought I would agree with Orochimaru on anything, but maybe we should have left you brats to die where we found you. Pain's eyes narrowed at the memory. Yes, you probably should have. Tsunade looked up suddenly as a faint whistling began to grow louder. Black shapes fell from the sky around her, smashing into the ground with cratering force before exploding violently. That proved too much for Gamabunta, and the abused toad finally returned to Miyabuku to recover. Incidentally, Tsunade suddenly found herself unarmed as the boss Tonto vanished with him. Suddenly Pain was in front of her, those steely, rippled eyes completely emotionless as he made to impale her with one of those black rods. She stepped back and tried to backhand him, but he weaved out of the blow's path with almost contemptuous ease. You are slow, slug Sunin. Retirement has done you no favors. Tsunade snarled and lunged at the man, but once again he easily moved out of the path of the deadly blow. This time though she pivoted with far more grace, sweeping low to break the Deva path's legs. Instead, she met an impenetrable wall of force before she was thrown back into a building. She was back up and charging again without hesitation, leaping forward with a battle cry and foregoing the blows altogether. If she could just grapple Pain, then she could break his back effortlessly. She got a black rod through the arm for her troubles, immediately throwing her chakra system out of balance. She ripped the thing out a moment later, placing a glowing green hand over the wound and closing it with an afterthought. Your control over your chakra lives up to its reputation, Pain commented offhandedly. Most would be unable to perform jutsu for a while after being scratched by my chakra rods. Barely a bee sting, the slug Sunin growled, bringing her hands together in a ram seal. The weight of her chakra immediately began to press on the surroundings, her body visibly glowing with golden light. The small blue diamond on her forehead began to grow outward in artful, twisting lines. Yin seal, rel dash. A hand was suddenly laid across hers, making her pause and the yin seal to retreat back to its innocuous form. That's enough Tsunade, get back to the medical area, they need you more there. Tsunade smiled sadly, running a finger down the red lines on Jiraiya's cheek. You hate using this technique. Of course I do, the man announced with his usual bluster. What am I without my rugged good looks? Tsunade gave him a lingering look before nodding and running off back to the main medical checkpoint, leaving the transformed Jiraiya alone again to square off with his former pupil. I thought you had taught us everything, sensei. This is new, Pain intoned, taking in the white-haired man's newly bulbous nose, tiny eyes, and elongated face tattoos. Well, a good teacher has to have some secrets, Jiraiya announced grandly, before coughing into his hand. Plus, I really hate how this technique makes me look. Well, that's because ya never finished the training yet, dumb tadpole, the elderly-looking toad on his right shoulder complained, whacking him upside the head with a scaled-down walking stick. Right, the man also had two elderly toads protruding from his shoulders. And watcha talking about Jiraiya boy? I think you look plenty handsome like this, you humans got eyes too big for ya, the other toad, that looked grandmotherly for lack of a better term, said. Okay, I know where this argument goes, Jiraiya interrupted before the grandfather toad could retort. Can we just focus on the guy trying to destroy my village? Well, why didn't ya say so, Jiraiya boy, you know how Ma likes to yap on. What was that, pa? Nothing dear, let's get on with this then. Pain had been watching the surreal interaction with stoicism. He knew that no matter how goofy Jiraiya acted, he was no less attentive to his surroundings. He was also taking the opportunity to get a feel for the man's new form. The sheer power he felt radiation off the Toad Sage was incredible. He would have to put more attention into this than he previously thought. Right, better put this ugly mug to use then, Jiraiya said as the chatter from the peanut gallery died down. I think there's a lesson I'm long overdue in teaching you, Yahiko. The human path had been led on quite the chase, discovering that most every trappable inch of the house had been rigged with something. If it hadn't, it was because there used to be a seal there. If he didn't have the Rinnegan, those would have been more dangerous. Currently he had Senbon, Kunai and Shuriken launched at him from a variety of creative angles, all poisoned of course. 3 separate flashbangs had gone off, which had been irritatingly effective in leading him into further traps. A smoke bomb had been rigged with an aerosol poison as well as some manner of irritant that, if not for a judicial application of chakra, might have seriously damaged his eyes. There had also been a number of oddly precise fire traps. It was only after enduring 5 minutes of this controlled chaos did he realize that the woman was using traps that wouldn't damage the house or the possessions within. He had determined if he couldn't find her, he'd draw her out. The response was unpredictable. The moment he had smashed one of the many pictures lining a nearby table, an innocuous little canister was thrown at him. He tried to kick it away, but touching it only set it off. After the fact, ears ringing and front severely burned, he theorized the canister had contained a number of rolled-up explosive tags. There wasn't much left of the room he'd been occupying. The message was clear: she would destroy the house before being drawn out. The human path's face twisted into a grimace. If she wanted to play that way, he was more than happy to comply. A mental command was all it took to have the Azura Path rain explosive ordnance on the house, obliterating the roof and filling the building with noxious smoke. One of the walls behind him gave a shuddering groan before giving out and collapsing inwards. The path gave it an idle look before picking his way through the debris to find his target. Tears of blood ran down Itachi's cheek as he stood at the center of the clearing. Black flames littered the grass, burning intensely, but never spreading. He had always hated the unnatural feeling of Amaterasu. The pretentious name didn't help. He had always preferred subtlety in his work. The irony of his Mangekyo's power was not lost on him. You doing all right there, Itachi-kun? Madara called out. To Itachi's eyes he was a fuzzy black figure with an orange blob for a head like some indistinct scarecrow. The comedy of the image did nothing to lessen the threat he felt from the man. Madara, even if it wasn't the Uchiha Patriarch, was a dangerous individual, capable of manipulating even the absolute power that was pain. If for nothing else, that made him a priority target. The Uchiha didn't answer, mind working tirelessly to examine every angle of the man for weakness. He had long enough to examine him while in the Akatsuki, but despite knowing that his technique had a 5-minute clock, he had found no way of forcing him past it. Naruto's idea had been good, but Itachi knew Madara had essentially an endless supply of Zetsu clones at his disposal. The gunbei was new, able to redirect improbable amounts of force in what looked to be most jutsu, including the black flames of the Mangekyo. "How is that plan coming on?" he asked Naruto. The redhead had been oddly quiet during the exchange, his expression a mask of focus. Had he known any better he might have assumed the Hokage was trying to enter Sage mode, but Naruto had never received Senjutsu training. "I need about half a minute," Naruto announced, his hands coming up and running through seals Itachi actually recognized. He was surprised he still remembered them. It had been a long time since had seen Naruto actually use the hand seals for the Hiraishin. He couldn't imagine what his former teammate hoped to accomplish. But if there was anybody he trusted more, then I believe I have one last thing to try. Itachi already regretted this course of action, but it may be the only thing that would work on Madara's space-time technique. It started slow, a swirl of visible red chakra around his feet, but that was enough to tip the older Uchiha off apparently. Finally pulling out all the stops Itachi? It's about time. The chakra grew, congealing and solidifying into an enormous figure around the Uchiha prodigy. Muscle wrapped around bone, sprouting armor to complete the gruesome visage of his Susanoo. The sword of Totsuka blazed to life in his right hand, and it was his hand. The Susanoo was as much an extension of his body as his eyes were. But will it be enough? Itachi took a step forward and the sword fell, leaving a fiery arc in its wake as it sliced through the air towards the masked man. Madara stood his ground, slamming his hand down and calling up a blazing orange barrier around his body. Uchiha Flame Formation. The barrier only stretched a few feet above the man, but it encircled him completely. It was clearly strong enough to stop his Susanoo though, just. The blade pressed in on the barrier, straining it but not breaking it. Itachi knew that if this came to a contest of stamina he would not win. Already he felt the ache using the ultimate technique of the Mangekyo put on him. Instead, the Yata mirror swirled into being on his Susanoo's left arm, which he immediately used to bash the flaming barrier. The reflecting mirror lived up to its name, shattering the jutsu and dissipating the chakra so thoroughly that Madara reeled back. Itachi used the opportunity to lunge forward again. This time he managed to spear the man on the ethereal blade. For a moment hope swelled in him, that the strain on his eyes, those precious hours taken from his life, hadn't been in vain. Madara's body began to blur, warping as it was pulled along the sword towards the glowing gourd at its base. If he could just seal the man in the bottle this would all be over. It was too much to hope for though, and as soon as Madara realized what happened his body swirled in on itself, appearing across the clearing in the same manner, unharmed. "Wow, that nearly worked," the man mused, not sounding all that concerned with his near brush with defeat. "Scary." "I'm sorry," Itachi said, the Susanoo fading around him as he staggered backwards. It would take him a few minutes to recover before he would be useful in this fight again. "Don't apologize," Naruto replied with a grim smile. That one moment where he was forced to teleport was all I needed, just one moment of tangibility. Itachi was uncertain of what his teammate meant until he noticed the redhead had finished his chain of hand seals. For a moment Itachi felt the world change. There was no other way to put it. It was akin to the feeling of being trapped in a genjutsu where everything was exactly the same, but he knew that wasn't the case. If his eyes weren't lying, Naruto had managed to split his chakra into its yin and yang components. The yang was channeled harmlessly out of his body, the grass visibly growing beneath his feet. The yin on the other hand. "Okay, this seems unfair," Madara muttered, foregoing the childish voice as he looked down at the Hiraishin marker that had not been on his chest a moment ago. Anko groaned as she staggered out of the ruins that used to be her bedroom, coughing into her hand. Her eyes were watering from the dust, but thankfully she wasn't injured. A hand instinctively strayed to her stomach, panic rising up her spine before it was relieved by the faintest of kicks. "That's my girl," she whispered, glancing around to take stock of the situation. She barely managed to turn before a hand wrapped around her throat, lifting her off her feet with ease before casually slamming her into the wall. The breath was knocked out of her, and with the strength of the grip on her neck, it stayed out. A pair of steely ringed eyes bored into her own. "Where is the Sanbijin Churiki?" The hand loosened enough for her to draw breath and answer, which she used to gratefully gulp in a lungful of air and promptly spit in his face. "Same place, you can go fuck yourself." The hand promptly tightened again, cutting off her airway. The human path didn't bother to ask again, simply holding her there as she struggled for air. Finally, when her face had begun to lose its color and she could see darkness creeping into her vision, he said, "I don't need to ask. I do so out of respect for the innocent life within you. Where is the Sanbijin key?" Again, his hand loosened. Anko's gasping was a lot less graceful this time. "My fiancé is going to destroy you." This time she thought he might have crushed her windpipe when he tightened his grip again. She flailed against him, even managing to stab him with a senbon. It might as well have been a light breeze for all the damage it did him. "I will only ask once more. God's patience only extends so far." If Anko retained the control to roll her eyes, she would have. As it was, she was only semi-conscious at this point, and the hyperventilation when he relaxed his grip was more reflexive than a choice. "I change my mind. I'm going to kill Dash." She was cut off when Payne's patience reached its limit. "Very well." With that ultimatum, he placed a hand atop her head, almost tenderly. In the next moment he pulled. There was a sickening ripping noise as something pale and translucent was drawn up out of Anko's body. She felt an odd lifting sensation, as well as a terrible coldness that seemed to suffuse her entire being. Then, like an elastic band, the world snapped back into place. She hadn't realized how utterly wrong all of that felt until it was over and she could draw in long, sweet lungfuls of blessed, real air. The human path had staggered back, blinking in confusion as he raised a hand up to his cheek. He jerked back again, and this time Anko could catch the silver blur that raced across her vision. "Don't." A silver streak, and Payne reeled, hurt. He was forced a knee as something fast took him in the side of the knee. "My." A crack echoed in the house as Payne was hit in the face again, nearly flooring him. "Nei-chan." This time Haya stopped in front of him, using her full momentum to drive her shoulder into Payne's face, sending him flying across the debris-ridden floor. She was like a wild animal, hair flying about her like a mane as she jumped onto his chest, hitting him over and over until her fists made little blurs in the air. Anko looked on with a weak smile, staggering to her feet. It transformed into a mask of horror as Haya was suddenly flung backhanded across the room with the same ease as somebody swatting a fly. When the human path got back to his feet, it was thoroughly disheveled and far less stoic. The orange-haired man was now scowling as he stalked across the room towards the silver-haired girl. "My patience is gone. I will have the answers I came for." Anko could only croak despairingly as the man picked up the shaking little girl, moving to place his hand atop her head. Only he couldn't. He looked down at the arm, but it simply hung limp at his side. In the next moment he felt the strength leave his fingers, allowing Haya to drop to the floor to scurry back to Anko. His vision blurred and eventually his legs gave in, leaving him prostrate on the floor, helpless as Anko stalked over, grabbing one of Naruto's old tantos out of a nearby pile of rubble. "What did you? Poisons should have no effect on me." The purple-haired woman wore a pained smile as she awkwardly made her way over, clutching her stomach protectively. "It wasn't a poison, it was a paralytic, a damn strong one, and you took enough to down a boss summons." Payne merely scowled up at her, before control of his facial muscles slipped him too. "This is not our, no Bothi Cab Den Goth," he slurred. Anko allowed herself a small amused smile before her face became cold. "And nobody fucks with my family," she snarled, before embedding the sword right through his chest. The first thing Payne noted was that Jiraiya was absurdly strong in this form. The first blow he had tried to block nearly broke his arm, which, with 3 of his other paths taken out and the other 3 similarly empowered, was nearly unthinkable. The black rods had come out quickly by that point, a necessity for redirecting the incredible power Jiraiya possessed. The old Sunin suddenly jumped, hand raised to the sky like he was trying to grasp the sun. In the next moment it looked as though he had succeeded, a titanic Rasengan swirling into existence above his palm. The noise of the thing was deafening, even before Jiraiya pointed it down and allowed it to drop like a bright blue meteor. There was no room to dodge, the spiraling sphere would encompass the entire marketplace. He raised a hand and summoned his eyes power for a similarly grandiose display of power, stopping the attack in its tracks. A quick mental command had the Azura path turn its attention away from its systematic destruction of key targets in favor of suddenly launching itself at Jiraiya's back. He should have known those 2 toads were more than simply decorative. They swiveled on the old shinobi's shoulders, one of them spitting out a spray of what looked to be oil, which the other swiftly ignited. The Azura path didn't stand a chance and Pain had already abandoned it before he felt the connection sever. He used the sudden influx of chakra to destabilize his own technique, similarly distorting the gravity around the Rasengan until the chaotic energies within suddenly found release. Despite Jiraya's newfound control, it was the only explanation for how he was able to sustain such an enormous mass of chakra that far from his own body, even he was unable to corral the unstable jutsu. The explosion could be seen across the entire village. It was too soon for another Shinra Tensei, so Pain was left to defend against the blast the old-fashioned way. He was no worse for the wear, but his cloak was in tatters. It was as he was shrugging it off, so that it wouldn't restrict his mobility, that Jiraiya burst out of the dust cloud. Immediately one of his black rods was in hand, aimed to impale the man on his own momentum. Jiraiya dodged the first with almost precognitive reflexes but was too close to avoid the one that slid out of Pain's other sleeve. He put his hand in the way, and against a lesser weapon his skin might have been enough to stop it. Whatever else this form gave him, he seemed far more durable, but Pain's chakra rods were no mere sticks. They speared right through the man's palm, to the clear surprise of the toads on his shoulders. Jiraiya ignored their surprised exclamations. The moment the rod has pierced his skin his head paused, a tear suddenly rolling down his cheek. He stood there, staring at the Deva path with those beady frog-like eyes. Nagato, what have you done? Pain's eyes merely narrowed. That form is truly impressive, sensei, for you to glean so much. However, he brought his other hand up to impale his old teacher only for the man to easily swat it aside now that he wasn't dealing with the sharp end. I already told you that there is only pain. He kicked forward and despite an impressive showing of flexibility from Jiraiya, there was only so much you could move when one of your hands was speared in place. The toad sage went skidding back, hardly looking fazed by the blow as he casually pulled the rod out of his palm and threw it aside. I will stop you, Nagato, and finally get a straight answer out of you, for all of this. Pain nodded slowly. I know you will try, sensei. Well, Toby drawled, pulling at the front of his robes where the hydration marker refused to fade away, as interested as I am to know how you accomplished this particular feat of impossibility. An application of pure yin chakra, Itachi said, sounding impressed despite himself. A ninjutsu variation on the Kurama clan's Kekai Genkai in order to place an illusionary hydration marker and force it into a modicum of reality. Fascinating. When Naruto gave him a sideways look he shrugged. I was given special dispensation to train under one of their genjutsu masters when I was younger, being the heir to one of the most powerful clans in the village had its allowances. He glanced back at the redhead. Does it function as a normal marker? And where did you even get the idea? I had the pleasure of meeting the Kurama heir, Yakumo. Lovely girl, she had reason to be grateful after our meeting. She was more than happy to help with a little project of mine. Itachi nodded slowly. Slow to apply, but if refined. The thought of such a technique was mind-boggling. The placement of hydration markers without the need for physical contact. He wasn't sure of a force that could withstand Naruto, if the Namikaze could master it. They were interrupted by Toby clapping slowly. Wonderful. A marvel of our age. Truly you are the next, well, me, he deadpanned. Still doesn't quite solve the problem that you can't hit me. The man paused when Naruto's smile turned vicious. Oh, but you gave me plenty of time to think on that. It's the funniest thing actually, before all of this I happened to be chasing down a certain rogue root leader, Danzo, maybe you know him. Based on the slight shift in Toby's posture, he did. It seems he'd been planning for a while on how to deal with me, or more specifically my father's, and by extension the Enai technique. He was in the unique position of both being the Enai student, with access to many of his notes, and a Fuinjutsu user of no small skill. Turns out that he had managed to cobble together a type of barrier seal that disrupts space-time techniques, all of them in fact, the very same seal that my clones should have finished placing around this clearing just about. The smile had taken on a predatory aspect, which Toby could see all too clearly now that Naruto had flashed right in front of him, the tanto he had swiped off Itachi's back reared back to strike. Now. Chapter 50, Official Endings. Toby brought the gunbei up on pure reflex, just diverting the sword from a lethal blow to his heart. In the next second it was brought around again, leaving a keening sound in the air as it split the space between them. Throat, lungs, kidneys, femoral artery, brachial artery. Naruto wasn't pulling his blows, he was going for the kill right from the start. Each swing, lunge, and parry came closer and closer to meeting its mark as Toby backpedaled wildly. He couldn't even use his gunbei's ability as Naruto wasn't using any jutsu, just pure unadulterated speed and kenjutsu technique. It became too much when the chain connecting the weapon to his person was suddenly severed. He looked down to find the severed links burning with black fire, some of it spreading to his cloak. He immediately tore it off, and the distraction cost him as Naruto caught the handle with his blade and flicked it out of his hands, wheeling around to strike at his visible eye. The entire clearing seemed to still for a moment when the mask cracked, splitting down the middle and falling in two separate pieces to either side. Naruto took the moment to observe his adversary, only to find him wholly unremarkable. There looked to be some strange scarring across the right side of his face, but other than that he looked like any other Uchiha, Sharingan included. Unremarkable, until one considers that he should have been standing next to one of the three remaining living Uchiha. Itachi? Naruto asked, keeping his blade trained on the man. With confirmation that he was an Uchiha, he didn't want to lower his guard for an instant. He seems familiar. Toby sneered, much of his mystique having vanished with the mask. Now he was just another shinobi, angry at the world. He summarily discarded his childish persona. I would only be familiar, wouldn't I, Itachi-kun? Even as a child you were an arrogant brat, too absorbed in the praise being lauded on you to notice anything below your nose. He turned to Naruto, meeting the redhead's eye with a piercing stare. And I'm disappointed in you, Naruto-kun, or should I call you Hokage-sama? You know I once changed your diapers? Look what you grew into, perpetuating the same broken cycle that destroyed your entire family. Naruto's eyes hardened. Not all of it. I healed, made a new family, accepted my loss and moved on. If you knew me as a child then. Realization dawned on him suddenly, a friendly face and big orange goggles that he used to think were so cool, a sullen boy with a shock of silver hair and big brown eyes framed by silly blue marks. Obito. Toby scowled. Oh no, Obito Uchiha died a long time ago, crushed under a rock and left for dead by the people he thought were his friends. He died again when his friend shoved his arm through the woman he loved. He died for the last time when the village he respected forgot all about him, just another name on a shiny black rock. I am a legacy, decades in the making, and I will bring this entire, corrupt, broken world down on its head. You're even more insane than I believed, Itachi intoned softly, staring at the man with a mix of pity and a calm alertness. Maybe, Obito granted with a lopsided smile, but you two aren't the only ones that can stall for time. Naruto felt it first, the subtle tug in the back of his mind that connected him to his Hiraishin tags. He shouldn't have felt those as long as the barrier seal was up, which meant somehow Obito had managed to. The plant things, he must have had them destroying the seal. He hadn't known because none of his clones had dispersed, he didn't have time to wonder how he had managed that. Acting on instinct he immediately flashed to the one he had placed on Obito, only to appear a few feet away, where the man had discarded his cloak. There was something else though, itching at the edge of his awareness. You see, I'm so many steps ahead of you it's almost dull watching you dance about like puppets on strings. The redhead's foot twisted at the same moment the tree behind Obito burst into black flame, the Amaterasu harmlessly passing through his body just as Naruto's Rasengan did. And now we're back to this tired old game. Well, it was fun boys. Even as the man talked and Naruto squared his stance, there was still that feeling, like something just out of sight, gears that refused to mesh. I gave Pain the task of locating the Jinchuriki, but I should know better than to delegate. I think I'll handle this personally, perhaps starting with your sister. His body began to twist and distort, twisting in on itself. And it clicked, the presence was deeply familiar but old. It was something Naruto hadn't felt in a long time, something he likely didn't even realize he was feeling at the time. The distinct sensation of one of his father's old markers, reactivated when the suppression field went down. On Obito's back. It was over in a blink. One moment Obito was swirling away, The next his body snapped back into normal reality, a sword impaled clean through his heart. Sharingan's eyes went wide as a hand came up to grasp impotently at the red-stained blade. "Baba the marker, aye, that's..." Naruto leaned in, no satisfaction in his voice as he whispered in the lost Uchiha's ear. "A gift from my father." A strange sort of look pulled at Obito's face for a moment as he reached forward, eyes unfocused. For just a moment he smiled wistfully. "So many steps ahead, as always, sensei." Then he fell forward, dead. Naruto took just a moment to breathe, not quite enjoying the moment, but relieved that this at least was over. "Did you know him well?" Itachi asked, moving up beside him. "Sort of. He was part of my dad's old genin team." He grimaced. "Kakashi's the only one left. I thought the other two died when I was really young. But yeah, I sort of remember them coming over to the house occasionally." He squatted next to the dead Uchiha, turning him over so that the scarred half of his face was concealed. "I remember Obito being so bright and cheerful, always goofing off. I can't imagine what happened to him to turn him into this." "Sometimes." A new voice called out, as a figure walked out of the tree line, hauling something big over their shoulder. "All it takes is time." Immediately Itachi and Naruto tensed, eyeing the newcomer warily. They had shaggy black hair and wore a shapeless, well-worn cloak. However, the most prominent feature was the demonic mask they wore, with a single eye hole. "Whoa, whoa!" he called, letting the bundle, which turned out to be a person, drop to the ground unceremoniously. He put his hands up, slowly moving to take it off. Naruto and Itachi didn't relax for a second. "I'm gone for all these years." He slowly removed the mask, surprising both of his old teammates with the face beneath. "And this is the welcome I get." Pain couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. His eyes tracked Jiraiya perfectly, he dodged every titanic blow the man dealt out, and somehow the hits still managed to land. It was like some invisible, unpredictable force was dogging the man's body, half a second out of sync with him. He raised a hand to blast the man back and Jiraiya simply jumped over the wall of force, leaping into the air like his senjutsu's namesake. The Sunin breathed in, chest expanding to ridiculous proportions, before spitting out a tidal wave of viscous oil. It was swiftly followed by twin gouts of flame, to ignite it, and wind, to fan those flames into an unbearable inferno. The conflagration quickly swallowed the ground, incinerating everything in its path. The only avenue left to the Deva path was to take to the roofs, where he was immediately met by Jiraiya bringing down a smaller, but no less enormous Rasengan. Again, Pain caught the spiraling sphere with a wall of force, only to get slammed in the side by another huge toad, this one holding a shield and a Sajumata. He corrected his ungraceful flight through the village, only to get blindsided by Jiraiya in the middle of the village's main avenue. Again, he dodged the man's vicious haymaker, only to get caught by that invisible force that followed his fist. All the while, his old mentor wore a grim visage as he mercilessly tore into Pain without any of his prior restraint. And Pain had grown tired of it. The next time Jiraiya charged forward he didn't simply level a Shinra Tensei at him, he forced everything back. The ground, the nearby buildings and even the Toad Sage, were pushed outward from him, leaving a neat crater almost 10 feet deep at its center. "This has gone far enough. Nobody else shall stand in the path of God. I will make the world realize that without pain, there is no understanding. Without pain, there can be no peace." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "I will make the world know pain." Konan's normally implacable calm had been thoroughly trodden on. In her mad dash to get back to Pain she had been completely blindsided by a trio of nightmarish pests. They were relentless. Clearly, she had been marked as some kind of high-priority target to have monsters like these after her. The skills she could attribute to skilled Umbu operatives, but these were just kids. She wouldn't be surprised if they were still a genin team. She had thought the Uchiha to be the main threat, Itachi's little brother if she wasn't mistaken. That alone would have been grounds to be cautious around the teen. Despite appearances, Itachi Uchiha unnerved her, but he seemed to be the one tasked with keeping track of her. The Sharingan was an adept tool for that, as well as predicting where she would go and directing his teammates accordingly. The pink-haired one, and how she regretted thinking that was a ridiculous look for a kunoichi, seemed to be tasked with hemming her in. Whether this involved changing the landscape into tactically placed walls, or simply collapsing buildings on her, with jutsu or sometimes just brute force, was apparently up to her discretion. She was irritating, but would have been manageable if she wasn't so damn resilient. Conan had trapped one of the streets with explosive tags and the girl had simply charged right through, healing her burns on the fly. Then there was the sword girl. If it was the Uchiha's job to direct her, and the medic's job to distract her, this was the one clearly meant to finish her. The fact that she could follow Conan into the air by stepping off it had caught her so by surprise that the girl's lethally wind-shrouded blade nearly managed to find its mark. That wasn't the extent of it either, the girl could also use it at range, sending nearly invisible blades of wind at her with strokes of the blade. It was all Conan could do to avoid the little monsters. She swooped low, diving into an alleyway. The sheets of paper that currently composed the outside of her body peeled away, forming a perfect, if hollow, clone that continued on in her place. The Uchiha had already seen through this trick once by tracking her chakra signature, so she dispersed into individual sheets of paper that immediately plastered themselves along the alley, adopting the colors underneath in a perfect camouflage. Even sensors couldn't find her when she was like this, her chakra was too diffuse. Sure enough, the purple-haired girl streaked past after her clone. Instead of setting up a trap for her, she allowed the girl to pass. She would find a nasty surprise if she managed to destroy her clone. The inside of it was entirely lined with explosive tags that could encircle and obliterate just about anybody. Just to be sure, she sent a flock of her homing cranes after the Uchiha to make sure he was distracted. She reformed a moment later, when the trio had moved on. For now at least, they were relentless beyond all belief. Having trouble? Conan nearly jumped. It was only her years of similar experiences with pain appearing out of nowhere that allowed her to simply turn with a raised eyebrow. They are merely children. The animal path observed her for a moment from within the mouth of his chameleon summons. That explained how he was able to sneak up on her. So were we, once. Were we really? Pain didn't humor her moment of introspection, his eyes tracking the trio of Chunin. The Kyubijin Cherokee has trained his students well. There are many powerful individuals in this village. Too many. Conan questioned with what approached disbelief. She had never seen anything that was a match for Nagato. Nobody can defeat God, Pain shot back almost reflexively. But it is time to end this. Searching out the individual Jinchuriki has become untenable. If need be, we shall deal with the beasts in person. You mean Desh, but it was already too late. The animal path slammed his hand into the ground and they disappeared in puff of smoke. They reappeared on the very outskirts of the village, well outside the wall. Conan could only watch on his way off. In the distance, a lone figure began rising up over the village, body silhouetted against the sun. This world shall know pain, Nagato said, before the animal path slumped over, inert. I'm going to default to you on this one, Naruto muttered, glancing across at Itachi without taking his eyes off the ghost in front of him. This is a genjutsu, right? That hurts, Shisui shouted indignantly, poking his chest, right here. The Uchiha heir seemed just as stunned. Even throughout the reunion with Naruto he hadn't displayed this much emotion. If it is, whoever cast it knows Shisui as well as we did. Naruto took a moment, staring at the supposed dead man before shrugging. Good enough for me. He was across the clearing in a flash, picking his old teammate up and spinning him around. Shisui. He put him back down, grinning broadly, right before he slugged the man right in the face. Ah. What the hell? The Uchiha complained, clutching his face and glaring up at the redhead with his one good eye. We should be asking you that, you ass. Where the hell have you been all this time? We thought you were dead, we saw you die. I'm more curious why you chose now to return, Itachi said, walking up to the pair a little more sedately and leaning forward almost tentatively to hug his friend. Well, long story about that, and yeah, for all intents and purposes you did see me die. Kota Amatsukami. Itachi ventured, looking thoughtful. Yeah, actually. But why the charade? Didn't you trust us? Naruto asked, sounding genuinely betrayed. At that, Shisui scowled. You can thank him for that. He kicked the bundle at his feet, flipping it over and revealing Danzo bound on the ground, blood leaking from the under the bandages across his right eye. Oh good, I worried he'd get away in all this mess, Naruto mused tonelessly, glaring at Danzo like a particularly bloody piece of meat. Yeah well, that's me, Shisui muttered, clearing up your guys' messes since time immemorial. When he received 2 flat stares he wilted sheepishly, coughing into his hand. But, yeah, explanations. He sobered slightly, meeting Naruto's eyes. I assume that since you became Hokage you know all about the mess with the Uchiha. Naruto nodded grimly, glancing across at Itachi who refused to meet his gaze. Well, we were both caught up right in the middle of that. The old man wanted to settle everything peacefully, but Fugaku wasn't having it. Danzo on the other hand. He gave the older man a kick for good measure, saw a different way of settling everything, namely, my eyes. I refused, something like that wouldn't actually help anything. It'd be like putting a plaster over a stab wound, a temporary fix at best. Itachi put it together first, how they had found Shisui that night by the river, the state of Danzo's face now. He tried to take your eyes by force. Shisui nodded solemnly. He blindsided me and managed to get one before I could get away, I couldn't let him get the other. So you faked your death, Naruto summed up. With the only credible witnesses that had political protection from Danzo's schemes. He looked down with a scowl. And we had to believe it was real, because if Danzo had access to that technique, we wouldn't even know what we might tell him. For what it's worth, I really am sorry. But what have you been doing all this time? Itachi asked. Waiting, he said, some of his old humor returning. I'd gotten really good at the whole hermit shtick too. But then somebody. He sent a sidelong glance at Naruto, had to get embroiled in a war. I figured I'd put myself to use and clean up before you could really put your foot in it. The Hokage put a finger to his temple and shook his head with a wry grin. I never was able to work out why all those Iwa troops pulled out of Kusa without explanation. Shisui nodded. Then I got word down the grapevine that something big had gone down in Konoha, only to find out Danzo was public enemy number 1. I've been camped out on the border ever since, waiting for my chance to catch the bastard. He reached into the satchel at his waist and pulled out a small jar containing green liquid. A sherry non-eye floated innocuously in the solution. Don't suppose you guys know a good eye doctor? The redhead grinned. At least 3 actually, I'll put in a word when all of this is over with and you can finally come back home. He was brought up short by Shisui's serious look. Naruto, I don't think I can come back just yet. I've just finally started to realize what a difference I can make out there. It's amazing how much you can do when everyone thinks you're dead. He let a small smile slip back onto his features. Besides, I've really caught something of a traveler's bug. Don't get me wrong, I'll definitely come back one day, can't leave cousin Sasuke to rebuild a clan all on his lonesome, just, not yet. Naruto paused a moment before nodded, letting out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. I think I understand. I'm afraid the situation is a bit more cut and dry for me, Itachi added. Like Shisui, my work isn't done. The disease isn't debilitating yet, and there is a lot I would still like to do, a few members of the Akatsuki left to hunt. Do you know how long you have? Naruto asked. 2, maybe 3 years if I don't exert myself. All 3 of them shared a wry smile. Itachi Uchiha did nothing but exert himself. But I have time enough. Again, Naruto nodded, unsure how to feel when faced with the prospect of losing his 2 best friends for the second time. Just remember to ask for help when you need it. Of course, the Uchiha replied with one of his mysterious little smiles, that's what teammates are for, are they not? So, I suppose the only thing left to do is deal with this clown, Shisui muttered, prodding the bound Danzo with his foot. Might be harder than you think, Naruto groused, feeling a deep temptation to simply kill the man here and now where there were no witnesses that would care. Even despite his actions recently he still has a great deal of political clout across the village, and pinning something on him specifically will be a nightmare for, what? He trailed off at the sight of Shisui grinning. I shouldn't worry about all that too much, just tell the interrogators to take a look at his right arm, I think they'll find it sufficient evidence for whatever they need. And on that note, Itachi cut in, gazing out over the mountain to where a single figure could be seen rising up over the village. I believe there are events that demand the Hokage's attention. Oh, I never did get to congratulate, and he's gone. Shisui sighed, turning to Itachi. He's gotten all precocious without us around, hasn't he? Itachi didn't answer, simply staring out over the panorama of the village, somewhat battered and harried as it was, with a small smile. Pain had a magnificent view as he rose higher over the village, one fit for a god looking down on his dominion. In a moment, all of this would be gone, obliterated under his singular power. The Jinchuriki would likely die, or not, it made no difference to him. Either way they would be far easier to capture. The Biju were brutes, mindless and slaves to their baser instinct. It would be child's play to subjugate them and feed their energy to the Gadamazo. This will be the start of a world at peace, the first major step in securing a world that has true understanding. They will know fear, they will know sorrow, and most importantly, Konoha will be the first to know pain. Shin dash. Funny. Pain never even saw it coming. One moment he felt the power building up inside him, rippling under his skin at the chance to be unleashed. The next he felt something smash into his back without mercy, sending him hurtling towards the ground. Naruto bounced once on his bastardized version of fuse technique, watching Pain's body crash back into the village in a large cloud of dust, then he let himself fall. I was thinking something similar. He vanished in a flash of red, reappearing right above the recovering Deva path with a large Rasengan already primed to deepen the small crater his body had made. He used the momentum of the technique to flip back onto his feet, watching the orange-haired man slowly regain his feet. We've met once before, but as a guest of the village, I feel I should give you a proper welcome. Pain raised his hand but Naruto was already gone, the wall of force hitting nothing but the building behind him. He reappeared next to the man, teleporting to the Hiraishin marker he had placed all those months ago when he had first met the Akatsuki leader. Welcome to Konoha, I'm Naruto Namikaze, the Go-Daime Hokage, and here's the tour. He grabbed the shaky man by the cloak and suddenly vanished. Only the birds could follow what happened from there as Naruto appeared and disappeared hundreds of times across the village in a few seconds, turning the streets red from his after-images. Every single instance of his technique's use was met by a brutal kick or punch, channeling the full momentum of his instantaneous travel and directing it right at the punching bag in his arms. On. Knee to the gut, B. Slammed into a wall, half. Elbow to the temple, of. Slammed into the ground, my. Kick to the knee, vil. Punch to the throat, H. Kick to the stomach, I. Roundhouse to the ribs, ask. Punch to the face, that. Thrown through a wall, U. Knee to the spine, kind. Elbow to the chest, Li. They reappeared back where they started. Pain hadn't even finished folding in on himself from the brutal blow to his torso, still in midair. Naruto now stood beside him, Rasengan swirling to life in his palm and a hard set to his eyes. Piss off. The ball of pure chakra came down like a comet, slamming the puppet body into the ground and carried on, drilling right through without mercy. What little glass had managed to cling to the nearby window frames finally gave up and shattered, leaving a light tinkling noise to go with Naruto's heavy breathing. He was suddenly very tired, the day's events finally catching up with him. It was rare he performed quite that many teleports in such a short amount of time and it was trying. Geez kid, overkill much. Jiraiya commented as he walked over, still bearing the marks and physical changes of his sage mode. Yeah, well, when I come from my own fight to find somebody had managed to cling on this long, in the middle of my damn village, I'm not going to treat them with a light touch. Jiraiya just nodded grimly, moving forward to gently close Yahiko's eyes. Probably for the best, I'm not sure there is such a thing as overkill for this one. You knew him. The older man sighed. I thought I did, a long time ago. But it's not ever yet, these were just puppets. I still have to deal with their true leader. Need some help? I still have some energy left in the tank. The Sunin gave him a sideways smile. Thanks kid, but some things a teacher needs to do himself, you know. The redhead nodded, watching Jiraiya take one of Pain's many piercings out. Yeah, I can understand that. He winced slightly when the man proceeded to stab himself with the sharp rod, immediately looking off to a specific direction outside of the city. So, being a sage makes you some kind of censor. The Toad-Sunin gave the Hokage a tired grin. Oh, now you're curious about senjutsu. Naruto shrugged, but Jiraiya had already moved on, sprinting off in the direction his senses informed him, leaving the young Hokage to his own devices. Lacking anything better to do in the sudden lull, he took to a nearby rooftop to survey the damage. It wasn't as bad as he feared, although a lot of genin teams would be pulling D ranks over the coming weeks. He smiled lightly at the sudden calm that descended as shinobi began to flit about, getting a better read on the situation. Konoha had survived worse. There was still a great deal left to do though, and his job was far from done. It would be almost idyllic if he could wrap everything up with a good fight, but he was a warrior second, a leader first. The thought of the paperwork that would accompany this mess was nearly enough to put a downer on his mood, but right now he had a family to go find. He wasn't worried on that front. Anko, even pregnant, could take care of herself. Yeah, Konoha would be just fine, and so would they. Itachi hunted in silence, tracking the oh-so-subtle traces left by the Zetsu clones. They were extremely hard to track, but his Sharingan hadn't deteriorated quite that far. It had been a mostly fruitless chase up until now, just the ordinary clone variety that would have died in a few days without direction. This one though, this one was dangerous. He found it limping away, having the misfortune to have latched onto one of the injured clones. It was an ugly thing, half black and half white, almost perfectly down the middle. A gruesome smile stretched across half its otherwise featureless face. Zetsu, Itachi announced, greeted almost casually, catching the creature unawares. It must have been quite panicked to be so out of sorts. To its credit, the thing managed to compose itself, turning with dignity despite its limp. Itachi, how strange to meet you all the way out here. It took a step forward as if to raise its arms placatingly, only to suddenly lurch forward, the arms extending into long, thick roots that grasped at the Uchiha scion. Itachi stood still and allowed himself to be enveloped, which should have been the first warning sign. It was also the only warning sign as, without fanfare, the Uchiha's clone exploded, taking much of the roots with it. Zetsu reeled back, hissing with pain, and turned to flee, only to come face to face with another Itachi, this one with a tanto raised. Zetsu was prepared this time though, and roots burst from the ground with sharpened points, impaling the Uchiha. The unnatural creature grinned as he saw real blood drip from Itachi's mouth, assured of his victory. Meanwhile, Itachi watched on stoically from the other side of the creature as it laughed at its illusionary victory. He pondered for a moment the best way to do this and settled on something that felt poetically appropriate. This creature had been a factor in the destruction of the Uchiha, so Itachi in turn decided on a very Uchiha-like solution. There was barely even ash left when Itachi was through incinerating Zetsu. The thing hadn't even escaped the genjutsu before it died. Even Uchiha had mercy. Shisui stood atop the mountain, watching the sunset with both eyes for the first time in too many years. It had been simple to henge into an umbu and drop off Danzo with T&I, they were too busy with the cleanup to scrutinize him too closely. Then it was just a matter of getting his eye fixed. Sneaking into one of the medical camps had been easy enough, although he stayed as far from Tsunade as he could. He still had his old Hitaiate, and was fairly certain nobody would remember his old mug, so didn't feel the need to risk a henge. A nice pink-haired girl had healed him up, not even asking why he was holding his own eye in hand, simply giving him the treatment before moving on to her next patient. A bit clinical, but he couldn't fault her handiwork. Experimentally he cycled through the stages of his Sharingan before reverting to his normal dark eyes. Just being able to blink normally again was heavenly. Sometimes it was the little things. With a last, longing look at his village, wreathed in the light of the rising sun, he turned and strode off. Konoha had a long road of recovery ahead of it, but he was certain Naruto could handle it. If he couldn't, well, he had him and Itachi working in the background. And now that he had both eyes back, there was a lot of work to do. Chapter 51, Epilogue. He had hoped it would be a small ceremony, something personal with close friends. Apparently, that wasn't much of an option for a sitting Hokage. The village needed something uplifting after the recent attack, so he had compromised. There was a medium sort of affair out in one of the training fields, prettied up with decorations and flowers provided by the Yamanaka clan, but for the rest of the village a pseudo-festival had been called. Right now, stalls were providing games and exotic foods while people walked about in their best yukatas. They were far from that, surrounded by their friends, close acquaintances, and a few important dignitaries the Hokage could hardly have refused. Well, he could have refused them, but the hassle involved with that wasn't worth a few simpering nobles to put up with. It had been a short, heartfelt affair with the Sandaime acting as their judiciary, although Naruto had almost been convinced to do it himself. It wasn't everything they had hoped, but Naruto had forgotten all that standing in front of the woman he loved. Anko hadn't minded too much either, as she kept reminding him in increasingly sultry and inappropriate tones throughout the ceremony, that the real fun came after the wedding. He stole a glance over at Anko Namikaze, he loved just repeating that in his head, as his wife, which was equally intoxicating to think, chatted with her bridal entourage. Ami and Sakura looked lovely in their pastel dresses, but Kurenai was sort of stealing the show nearby. Asuma looked distinctly uncomfortable in his formal attire. None of them held a candle to Anko. With her hair let down, a rarity for her in public when she had spent so long fostering the hard-ass reputation, and some artful touches of makeup to highlight her lips and eyes. Naruto had nearly choked when he first saw her at the ceremony itself. Her dress was unorthodox, rather more risque than was traditional, but after months of waddling about with a protruding stomach she had felt the need to reassert her image in the most breathtaking manner possible. He couldn't argue with the results. Currently, she was lavishing in the attention from their various guests. A few were sincerer than others, but Anko was having a wonderful time messing the vacuous sycophants about with elaborate word games. Nobody turned insulting the oblivious into an art form quite like his wife. There was that pleasant thought again. Yes, I'll have a think about it, he muttered absently to the man in front of him. Some noble from the capital he hadn't bothered to remember the name of. There were a few lurking about trying to curry favor with the Hokage. The man didn't bother to mask his annoyance at being fobbed off, but the groom didn't care. He could have rationalized that he saw somebody important he needed to talk to, but it was his wedding and he didn't want to talk to this man. That was enough reason for him. He passed a few people generally enjoying the lively atmosphere, most of them already naturally falling into their groups. There was his team's graduating class looking very out of place in their nice clothes, save for Ino who was drinking in the attention. The other Jonin-sensei and their group of friends, mostly enjoying the alcohol and recounting various stories about the bride and groom without any heed paid to the usual decorum of the occasion. He blamed Kakashi for that. Then there was the older crowd, the clan heads and parents, people who had been friendly with Minato and Kushina. They were treating this like any other social function, a chance to scheme and snipe at each other good-naturedly. Naruto skirted around them all, offering pleasantries as he passed but with his eyes reserved for one individual alone. "Hello there, Mrs. Namikaze," he mumbled into her neck, wrapping his arms around her waist and drawing gushing looks from the heavily female crowd. Anko practically purred at the attention. "Hello yourself, Mr. Namikaze." "Okay, I gotta get a picture of this," Ami said, pulling out a camera before thinking better of it. "Wait, something's missing. Suko-chan." Sakura walked over, looking almost as uncomfortable as Asuma in her dress, although that may have been because of the little bundle in her arms. Fuzzy red hair peeked out of the cloth-wrapped package. She gratefully handed it over to the mother. Anko took her daughter with a warm smile. "Are you having fun at the party, Kaze-hana?" "Yes you are. Yes you are." Naruto forgave his wife the cooing. He indulged in it himself when away from prying eyes. It was hard not to. His daughter was adorable, with her chocolate eyes and 2 little whisker marks on each cheek. Anko had been nearly insufferable when she had been proved right. "Come on, scoochin' together," Ami called, squaring up the frame to capture the new family together. The result was an adorable picture of the 3 of them in an intimate embrace. "Not yet," Naruto called out as she was putting the camera down. "I want a group shot." He ushered everybody in, and completely underestimated who exactly comprised everybody, resulting in the most awkward mishmash of guests imaginable. Naruto and Anko stood at the center, looking every inch the Hokage and his wife, with their newborn daughter between them. Sakura smiled at Naruto's side, the expression looking a bit too put on to be truly genuine, but she was getting better. Next to her stood Sasuke, looking quite happy for once, with an easy smile. Sakura and Ami made up their other side, Sakura graciously allowing Ami to stand next to her mentor. Naturally Haya nestled herself right between her adoptive siblings, but not before making sure to give Kazehana a jealous look. It was only when Jiraiya, previously schmoozing as many female guests as he could manage, realized a picture was being taken did things get hectic. He naturally dragged Tsunade and Shizune with him, which caught Kakashi's attention, who inevitably drew along Guy and Lee, who in turn pulled in the rest of their graduating class and an embarrassed-looking Kurenai. Komaka felt left out and barged into the front, bringing along Yojeo and Tenzo. Hiruzen stood in front of his students, wearing a proud smile, and a few of the clan heads Naruto had grown familiar with over the past few months piled in for good measure, acting decades younger as they jostled to stand near their kids. Even Ensui had shown up, from his, in his own opinion, well-deserved retirement, for the benefit of his one remaining student. By the end of it all Naruto and Anko looked distinctly squished together, but both were beaming brilliantly. "Why the hell am I taking the picture?" Asuma grumbled from in front of them all. "Because we want to see people in the photo, not just a cloud of smoke," Anko called back, earning grins and laughter from the entire group. That was how they were captured, happy, together, enjoying the time they had despite the recent attacks. A village, and a family, that endured. That's it for part 13. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.